I always had the impression that Super Mario Land is an underrated game. When people mention Mario, it's either the first title, one of the classic sequels, or a modern title. And it's not like this train of thought is wrong. The franchise has a lot of good entries, but I think that most don't give the Game Boy entry the credit it deserves. Disregarding my obvious bias and fascination for the game and the handheld, Super Mario Land did do things that was refreshing for the series at the time. The game itself is a technological marvel, a byproduct of people who knew what they were doing. Quick history lesson. Super Mario Land was released in 1989. It was a launch title for the DMG and the first Mario game released for handhelds. While obviously developed and published by Nintendo, the game's creation didn't involve Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto. Instead, development was handled by Nintendo R&D 1, led by Game Boy inventor Gunpei Yokoi. I specifically mention this because I was honestly surprised that this is an important point for some people, instead of being an interesting note in the game's history. To quote Jeremy Parish of Game Boy Works, some people think of Super Mario Land as an imposter, some bootleg fake masquerading as a real Mario game. Now, I understand concerns regarding who develops what game. It's still a thing in recent times, but the game, despite its weak points, is a solid title. Shouldn't we judge a game based on how it plays? And even if you fight tooth and nail for the developer argument, in my opinion, it holds no ground. It's all arbitrary legitimacy. You're forgetting the fact that the people involved in the development were not a bunch of newbies. This was a group of people with a long and solid track record. This isn't their first foray in game development, and they were being led by the guy who was heavily involved in the development of the DMG. You know, the platform the game is on. Another thing I noticed was that there are some that would detract the game because it was a smaller Mario game on handheld. Well, no shit, and let me explain. For those who weren't born in the 90s or early 2000s, handheld gaming was an entirely different thing. Unlike today, where the line between console and handheld gaming has, in my opinion, been severely blurred by, say, the Nintendo Switch, back then there was an obvious distinction between the two. In general, home consoles are viewed as superior. The technology used between the two were severely different. There's the notion that games on home consoles had better presentation, audio and content, better technology, and a better form of storage media. Back then, home consoles were considered the long gaming session machine. You don't expect something like a JRPG on a handheld at the time. Handhelds, on the other hand, had more limitations to take note of. The fact that they ran on batteries severely affected a game's design and content. Games on handhelds back then were designed to be easy to pick up and drop. Easy to pick up means games that are easy to learn and play, while easy to drop means you can quit the game at any time, with your lost progress almost inconsequential. Alternatively, this could be awareness on Nintendo's part about battery life. This explains why most of the launch titles are arcade-like in nature, and how it took years before games on the DMG evolved into longer and bigger games, an obvious example being Pokemon. Going back to Super Mario Land, looking back at it now, it seems to be in a weird middle ground. On one side, it has to be of the same quality, a need to live up to the previous titles. On the other hand, it has to work with or around the limitations of the handheld. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to make excuses for the game's pitfalls. For example, compared to the previous entries, Super Mario Land didn't age well. There are some aspects of the game that's disappointing, like the boss fights. The graphics, while serviceable, feel a bit simple. However, I do think it's unfair to dock points from a game, so to speak, because of the limitations of the platform it's on. I agree that compared to the older titles, the amount of stages in Super Mario Land is lesser, but you have to remember this could be due to the handheld's memory constraints. it's a different thing if the stage count was lesser because of incompetency when more could have been done. And it's not like the stages weren't designed well. They were able to stand out from each other, each with their own looks, feel, and gimmicks. Yes, the graphics is simple, but you have to take into account the graphical capabilities of the DMG. And to be fair, it's not like the graphics are undiscernible. You can tell that is Mario, it is a mushroom, that is a piranha plant. If the sprites were god-awful, we'll have a different story. Honestly, I find my stance in this video f***ing ironic, as I remember having a quick discussion with someone on Reddit about racing games on the GBA. I didn't understand his point before having the discussion. Being put in almost similar scenario gave me a huge deja vu. Moving on, let's talk about the other stuff the game did aside from all the things I mentioned so far. The game has a shift in the setting and storyline. While you're still saving a princess, this time you're traversing through Sarasaland. You're saving Princess Daisy from the main antagonist, the space monster Tatanga. Sarasaland, though weird when put next to the Mushroom Kingdom, still feels correct. It's still able to mesh well with the fictional world of Mario. And this is perplexing since some parts of Sarasaland is inspired or based on real-world places. I honestly don't know how they were able to do it. What I do know is despite the familiar landscapes, it doesn't take away from the fun and it's certainly creative. For gameplay, it's still the familiar Mario experience we know and love, and then some. The controls are as good as the previous games. There is no slippery ice physics when moving around. Running is still important when traversing through levels. The run speed also feels just right. However, you can't instantly change your direction while running. Jumping, though responsive, feels a bit floaty. I also noticed you can't change your jump direction mid-air. Power-ups return, but some are not as we know them. Instead of the Fire Flower, we get the Super Ball, which has its own quirks. You can only have one present in the screen, and it bounces around if it doesn't collide with an enemy. The ball can also collect coins when hit, which gives it some utility. The 1-up isn't a mushroom but is instead a heart. Not a major change, but it makes sense considering the mushroom sprite is used for making Mario big. Coins make a return and is still partnered with the lives count. What surprised me is the integration of the score system with the lives. Most games at the time had a score due to video games' arcade roots. We were still transitioning from arcade to home consoles. There really wasn't any use for them outside of high scores or gratification. In Super Mario Land, whenever you accumulate 100,000 points, you get an extra continue. This lets you continue from the last stage played when you get a game over. This is, in my opinion, ingenious because scores are literally just there in games from this era. Stages are still divided into worlds. As mentioned earlier, there is a lower stage count, but the stages are well designed and memorable. And the lower stage count isn't as impactful as some try to make it sound. There are 4 worlds with 3 stages each, for a total of 12 stages. Each world has its own boss, which you will encounter at the end of each world. Normally, stages are side-scrolling platformers, but every now and then it will be a side-scrolling level with Mario in a vehicle. This serves as a nice breath of fresh air, despite a major deviation from the core gameplay loop. Going back to the usual stages, they all end with the Gold Tower with 2 entrances. The upper entrance will bring you to a bonus game that allows you to get some extra lives, while the lower entrance will just send you to the next stage. Boss fights are the lowest points of the game. They all play the same despite the stage changes. The gimmicks they have are rather superficial and there is no progression or evolution to them. You either shoot until it dies or bypass them for an instant kill. Enemies are similar to the power-ups. Some are returning, but they don't behave as we know. A good example are the Nokobons, which are Koopas that turn to a bomb when stomped, and Gira, which are missiles that are fired from bill blasters that emerge from pipes like piranha plants. The game does introduce a bunch of new enemies to fill the roster of each world. Presentation-wise, Super Mario Land is simple but enough to have its own personality. Though the DMG's graphical and sound capabilities aren't as good as other handhelds or consoles at the time, I think the game makes good use of it. The graphics are communicated and designed well and definitely adds to the game's supposed weird and quirky nature. The music is an instant classic as the composition definitely has the Mario vibe and feel. Super Mario Land might not compare to its older siblings, but it definitely can stand by itself. And to be fair, the game only falls short when compared to something like Super Mario Bros. 3. And let's be frank, was there anything as polished as it back in '89? Even though game design for the Game Boy has evolved since the game's release, I still think Super Mario Land can provide a good challenge to a majority of the Game Boy's games, whether they're platformers or not. This has set the standard at the time, and I think it sets a good baseline, a sort of core requirements for platformers. Please give this game a try when you can. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.